Get underway. Thank you all for joining us. I apologize at the scheduling. We normally do this every other month on the second Wednesday of the month. That would have been earlier this month, but I was out of the country, and so we couldn't do it then, and the Judson Church very kindly allowed us to move it to this Wednesday. But we will resume, not in October, but in November, second Wednesday of every month. Hands are raised over here. Someone looking for someone. You don't want to sit next to someone you don't want to sit next to.
Excuse me, your notice online said bi-monthly, second Wednesday of every other month.
Right.
Not every month.
Every other month.
Right.
Second Wednesday, that's right, of every other month. So the next one will be November, whatever the second Wednesday of that month is. All right. Very quickly, these events are brought to you by three cooperating entities. One is the Left Forum, the annual collection of people that usually happens somewhere in the City University of New York system, as it will in 2019. You can always find out information about the Left Forum and what it's doing and how it's building by going to its website, leftforum, all one word, .org. The second entity is the Judson Memorial Church, in which you are currently sitting. And they also make this space available to us with the extraordinary comment from the minister that what we do here every other Wednesday, she considers to be part of the mission of this church. So you could not have a warmer host than this church has been for us now for quite a while. And it tells you something about the church as well. I'm sure she wouldn't mind my saying it, but she's very active in the sanctuary movement and is a key part of that here in the New York area, as this church is also.
Protecting traders.
What?
Never mind.
Yes, that's right. With a T, spelled with a T. And the third entity is Democracy at Work. That's the group that I work with. We actually produce these evenings as we do the radio and TV show Economic Update every week, which is now in its 7th year and is broadcast every week on about 95 radio stations across the country. And through the Free Speech Network and Comcast, it goes into about 55 million homes in the United States. Unfortunately, that does not mean that 55 million people are watching it. It just means it's available if we can get them to watch it, which we are working on. Okay, and are you looking for chairs? There are. If someone raise your hand if you're near an empty chair. So folks, thank you. No problem. It all goes down better if you're sitting. This series of bi-monthly talks now has its own Patreon page. I'm assuming, I hope I don't do that very often. Patreon is a fundraising mechanism. It's a way of getting our projects out and allowing people to support them. If you're interested in seeing this, what we're about to do, on the internet, just go to Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/ and then the initials of this thing, GCLEU, Global Capitalism Live Economic Update. And for as little as $1 a month, you have access to a great deal of material that we put up there. But it's a way for you to support us as we produce materials for you. In addition, you can go to our YouTube channel. You can also see it there. We ask if you do that to subscribe. It's very simple. Just hit the subscribe button, as well as the little bell there, and you will receive updates every time we load something up on that area, which is fairly often. We are expanding the podcasts we produce. Economic Update is available, the radio and TV show, as a podcast. And so are the two others we now produce, and we're adding more. Puerto Rico Forward, which is produced in Puerto Rico from our perspective about what's going on there. And our latest, Capitalism Hits Home, with Dr. Harriet Fraud, that some of you know because she's on the program quite often, talking about how these kinds of economic things that we talk about impact personal life, household life, intimate relationships, and so on. All of those podcasts are available at our website, democracyatwork.info, but they're also available on Apple Podcasts and Google Play. You can get them, in effect, in every platform. Last but not least, we have expanded, fundraising being what it is, and we now have shirts that say Democracy at Work, and they're available in the Democracy at Work store. They feature quotations from one Karl Marx, one Rosa Luxemburg, and a few from myself. All of them are union made. They're made by union co-ops. If you're interested, again, go to our website, democracyatwork.info/store, and all the details will be available to you there. Okay, so much for the commercials.
Very nice shirt.
Very nice shirts. Look, there's a shirt. And she will confirm there was no coordination between us prior to this evening. Thank you very much. Oops, sorry about that. Sorry about that. I cannot hit my chest. That destroys the microphone. All right. We always start with a few little items, so I'm going to get those out of the way so we can get to the big one because it's very, very important. The Federal Reserve today, for some of you who watch this sort of thing, raised interest rates again in the United States, another 1/4 point. Raising interest rates is something you need to pay attention to for two reasons. It tells you what's going on in the economy and what the people who run it, I mean the people who really run it, what they're thinking and doing, and it also tells you what to expect. The first thing to expect is that if they raise the interest rates, all of the things that have interest rates in them will go up in price for you. That includes everything. So this is going to raise the price of everything. Not just when you borrow money, it'll raise that price. One of the things you'll see is that that monthly small number on the credit card bill will become a slightly larger number because the interest rate they can charge goes up because they have to pay more for the money they're lending you when you use a credit card. I should use this more. Can everybody hear me all right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. But other things, everything that is marketed to you, a shirt, a hamburger, it moves by means of corporations that borrow money. And if they have to pay more for the money, they pass it along to you in a rising price for everything. So raising the interest rate is going to raise prices in this country. It will then come as a bit of a surprise for those of you not used to this arcane field of economics, that one of the key purposes of raising the interest rate is the anxiety of the Federal Reserve about the prospects for inflation. In other words, they're very, very worried that the enormous increase in the quantity of money circulating in our economy, particularly since 2008, we're going to come back to that later, but because of the crash in 2008, the decision was made at the highest levels of the government, at that time Bush, then Obama, and now Trump too. Changing those people makes no difference on these subjects. Makes no difference on a lot of subjects, but on this one in particular. They flooded the economy with money to kind of boost things. That's why interest rates went way down, to make it easy for banks and others to borrow the fresh new money that the government made available. So it pumped up the economy with money. Now, for a while, the only place that money went, basically, was into the stock market, which is why the prices of stocks have been going up nicely, for which Mr. Trump takes credit. He has nothing to do with that. If you pump in money and there's no reason for the money to be used to produce goods, and why not? because wages in America have gone nowhere. Nobody can buy anything. And people are afraid to borrow because of what happened leading up to 2008. So the money that's being printed isn't going into producing more, there's no market. It's going into buying in shares, speculating, driving up the market. But the fear is that all of this extra money might at some point think that it's wiser not to buy shares of stock because they're really high, but instead go into hard assets, land, buildings, real things. And at that point, you've got way too much money looking after way too few things to buy, and that will drive the price up. That anxiety that an inflation is lurking there is what leads them to raise the interest rates, hoping thereby to calm and slow down the economy so that the money isn't tempted to go into hard assets and drive up their price. That's what their anxiety is. That's why they raise the interest rates. But because doing that makes borrowing money more expensive, it means if you want to buy a house, your mortgage will be higher. If you want to buy a car, your car payments every month will be higher. If you want to go to college, you're going to be borrowing money for that. You're going to get stuck sooner or later with more there. Same with your credit card. It slows things down, and that's why the president, who is not supposed to comment on this independent agency, the Federal Reserve, beat up on the man he put in that job, Mr. Powell, within minutes of the Federal Reserve today announcing the interest rate. It's not good for the election in November because, excuse me, it's going to show up by November in rising prices, and the fear is that with all the other wonderful things Mr. Trump is doing, the Kavanaugh efforts and all of that, he's not going to be looking good to the people he needs to come out and vote for him, because they will be thinking he hasn't helped them as much as they had been led to expect. So that's what the drama, and you'll pick it up in the newspapers tomorrow and the next few days around the Federal Reserve is. The second thing is a piece of wonderful news I'm sure will please you, which is why I'm telling you. Harvard University, which is the richest university in the United States by far, announced that it had completed its latest fundraising drive and raised $9.62 billion. $9.62 billion. Very proud, from 155,000 households who all gave, and the report by Harvard lists the contributions as gifts. So 155,000 households gave gifts to Harvard. So I just want you very quickly to go through with me what this means. First, this is already the richest university in the United States. It has been for a long time the richest university. It is therefore the university that needs the money least. So therefore, it is important to understand the efficiency of our system that gives the most money. This is the record. No one has ever raised this amount of money before, no university. So it's important to understand that the university that needs it least got the most. If you grasp that simple principle, you will understand much about capitalism, which is organized like this. But we're not done. We're not done. Every household that gave the gift, because these are upper income households, you know that because I'm not going to embarrass anyone here by asking each of you to stand up and tell me how much in gifts you gave to Harvard, because that would be a short process and our time is pressed. But every one of those gifts is from a family with means. And you do know that under the law of the United States, every dollar given by a wealthy person to a thing like Harvard means they can reduce the income tax they pay both to the federal government and to the state governments, wherever they live, for a portion of that. So for every dollar, for example, if you're wealthy and your total taxes, federal and state, add up to 30, 40%, which they will, well then out of every dollar, it really only costs you 60 cents because the other 40 are going to come back and reduce taxes to you. So the decision of these 155,000 rich families to give a gift deprives the United States and the state governments of an enormous amount of money they need for unimportant things like schools and highways and hospitals. So the next time you cheer for how wonderful it is that Harvard, which doesn't need it, got all this money, remember that it is offset by a huge drop in the revenue of the state and federal governments, who will therefore not be able to do what they might otherwise have done. But fear not, in the statement of the, I should be, for purposes of disclosure, I'm aware of this because I get documents from Harvard since I went to school there, and I'm an alumnus of this place, and you can see the deep impression it made on me. Anyway, in the bottom of the thing they sent us, there's a statement, they just got rid of the woman who was the head of Harvard for a few years and replaced her with a man, I forget his name, and he assures us that the purposes to which Harvard will devote the $9.62 billion are, I kid you not, to improve the world. And the picture below the statement is of the really beautiful new renovation of one of their lounges in their building, which clearly improves the world because the lounge is in the world, and therefore the sensitivity with which these documents are produced tells you another thing about the atmosphere at Harvard. They spent a lot of time working about it. Okay, last. The Associated Press announced today a survey of drug prices. I thought it was really interesting. You'll catch it if you go check out Associated Press stories today. There haven't been any cuts in the prices of medical drugs and medicines. In fact, they found that for every drug that went down in price, there were a few, 96 went up in price. It's a 96-to-1 ratio between the prices that went up and down. You may not remember this because you may not hang on every word Donald Trump says, but if you did, you might remember that back in May he said within 2 weeks we would all see a tremendous drop in drug prices. Well, that was May. We are now coming on October. It's more than 2 weeks. Not there. And keep that in your mind because this gap between what is promised and what is delivered is sooner or later going to catch up. And at the end of today, you'll see that that's kind of the punchline of where we're going to be going. Okay, let's turn then to what is called the emerging market crises. This is very serious. You will not read much about it because we don't do much in this country with what happens elsewhere. So let me just alert you if you're not from those parts of the world where you pay attention. Venezuela, Turkey, Argentina, Indonesia, at least those four are in terrible trouble. There are more, but those four countries are in really terrible trouble. And while they're not identical, they do have something in common, which is the chaotic, disorganized way global capitalism works. But put it very simply, we've had two crashes so far this century. We had at the very beginning, in the spring of the year 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. And then in 2008, the whole thing went down. And in response to both of them, as we've mentioned already, the Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to make it dirt cheap. By the way, they went all the way to zero, and in some cases, negative interest rate. A negative interest rate is when you borrow $100 on the condition, and the bank is very strict, that you give them at the end of the year 99. That's a negative interest rate. They actually are paying you to borrow money from them. That's when you're desperate to get people to borrow money if you're paying them to do it, since the norm is to charge them for doing it. Okay, there's still, by the way, some places in the world that have negative interest rates, even as we're speaking. In any case, interest rates went so terribly low that you had a kind of a cathartic moment. You had a cathartic moment for businesses because every project that you might have held back on as a young businessman or woman, you could now get money for virtually nothing to try it out. To do that thing you were sure was going to make it, that project that would be profitable and all of that. And so businesses started borrowing this free money. And we know individuals did it because after the dot-com bubble, when interest rates dropped, that's when everybody went crazy on the housing and produced the collapse of the subprime mortgages in 2008. Too many people borrowed too much and couldn't pay it off. And governments got in the act too, borrowing more than they had ever had before. Indeed, if I had more time now, I would show you that in the aftermath of the crisis of 2008, what often happened was banks and corporations couldn't pay back their loans, so they were transferred from the books of those entities to the government. The government basically came in and took on more debt to offset the reduction of debt on the part of people who couldn't pay it. That's the way you keep a system going. You move the debt to the government. We know the government can pay it because they make the money, literally. They always can pay it. So if you give it to the government, you have an automatic mechanism to just flood the economy with money, which is what they did. In any case, there was too much borrowing, way too much. And especially in the third world, especially in Indonesia, Argentina, Turkey, and Venezuela. Solving problems that those countries had, they couldn't solve any other way, but by borrowing at incredible low rates. But a condition was attached most of the time to these loans. They were what we call dollar loans. In other words, they were given dollars, and they had to pay the interest in dollars. That means they have to produce goods, in Argentina, let's say, which they can sell on the world market to get the dollars, because they have to have dollars, to pay it back. If their economy gets into trouble and the value of their currency goes down in relationship to the dollar, the burden on them becomes impossible. That's Turkey right now. That's Argentina. Argentina was given an IMF loan, the largest loan the IMF has ever given anybody today. $57 billion given to Argentina so that it does not collapse next week. In other words, you have countries that are literally on the edge of dissolving and have to be bailed out because they can't possibly cover the loans they took when times were different. And as if to mock them even further, by raising the interest rates, they're going to have to pay even more to cover those loans than they did before.
What would happen to them if they just couldn't pay? Why would they collapse?
If they couldn't pay, all transactions with them would stop. Everybody who's a creditor of that country would immediately go to court and sue everybody for anything that they could get their hands on. You'd have litigation for the rest of all of our lives in this room, as every company, every individual, suppose you sold to, you're a company and you sold bicycles to Argentina and you shipped truckloads of them. You're owed X thousands of dollars. You want to get paid. They don't have any way to pay. They don't have any dollars. They go to the IMF, they get the dollars, they pay you your bill. You're not going to sit there and say, oh, it's too bad, it didn't work out. You're going to go right to court. You'll immediately get an Argentinian lawyer, he will go in, nothing can move. Nobody can do anything, nobody knows, nobody will lend to that company because they'll know that there's a litigation against them, so it's not safe to do business with them. If you're a worker, you'll leave because you're not clear you're going to get paid next week. Where would they get the money from? It's something that Americans haven't understood because it hasn't happened here yet. It came that close in 2008. In the last 4 months of 2008, September, October, November, December, there were meetings at the Federal Reserve, you can walk there from here, where it was discussed, if we don't do this was the conversation. If we don't do this, there'll be no milk trucks coming in from New Jersey to the bodegas of the city. So there'll be no soda pop, there'll be no bread, there'll be no, and then the people will go crazy. And then what will we have? We will have nothing, we'll have chaos. That's what these countries face.
But you're talking about a loan to the Argentine government, and your example is both.
No, it's both. It's both loans to the government and loans to private enterprise, and even loans to individuals. The individuals, there's a lot of borrowing in these countries. When interest rates were low, they all want to be homeowners too. So they borrow. And what they don't know is they've borrowed from a bank, which in turn has borrowed dollars in New York. So that's got to be paid. And if the local person pays their mortgage in whatever the currency of Argentina is, that's not going to help the bank, because that's not a way to pay off the dollar loan that you owe. The Argentinian person who took out the mortgage may not know any of that, probably doesn't, but they're stuck anyway. And the bank will turn on them and say, you got to give me more, but I don't have more. Well, then we take in your house. But what good is my house? You're not going to be able to sell it. Everybody in the neighborhood's like me. Yes, that's when the system breaks down. Nobody can move. Nobody can do anything. It actually happened in the United States. In July, in August, in September of 2008, banks in New York were unwilling to deal with each other. When remember Lehman Brothers, the big collapse of that old established bank, that was thought to be unthinkable. And the next morning, nobody would make a loan to Citibank because they didn't know if Citibank was going to do that the next day. And if you fall apart and you declare bankruptcy, you don't pay your debts. That goes into litigation. That can take years before anybody gets paid anything. Meanwhile, your business collapses because you had to have that money, which you put in there overnight, and you want it back. Sorry. Lehman Brothers told lots of people that morning, you know the $4 billion you gave us yesterday? Gone. This produced a real upset, as you can imagine. So no one knows quite how this is going to play out, and the great fear is that it isn't those 4 countries, it's 40. And that we're only waiting for the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And as the interest rates go up, the burden on these societies to come up with payments. Well, you ask yourself, well, why did they borrow so much? Well, because the interest rates were so low. Why were the interest rates so low? Because capitalism had a crash in 2008. And the whole idea then was to get people to spend money to keep the economy going, which by borrowing they did. So it solved the problem for a while. But in capitalism, every problem solved is a new problem created by that solution. And if you don't look, it'll just come back and surprise you by biting you in your rear end a year from now or 2 years from now. The contradictions of the system you have to look at, not because you need to be a Marxist and like contradictions or study Hegel or something, but because the contradictoriness of everything is your only way to be in some way prepared for the other parts of it. Every time you hear one of these yokels telling you about a win-win situation, talk to somebody else. So this is a crazy person. Or they have discovered something that the world has never seen before. Sir?
You have such brilliant insight, Rich, I'd like to say that. And I hear
That's nice.
of the separation that we see going on, not just America. How do you feel that to be fixed? Because I've heard so much how we're separating it. In your opinion, what do you feel would fix completely?
It's hard for me to answer that question because you need preconditions for the very idea of fixing to have any meaning. I mean, let me be as blunt as I can with you because I think you'll enjoy it anyway. Mr. Trump has appeared at the UN twice. The first time, a few months ago, he explained how he was seriously thinking of obliterating North Korea from the face of the earth. This to an organization that came out of the horror of World War II, whose whole idea was not to resolve problems by threats and force. Now he comes back a few months later and he basically runs the same game, only as a new country, Iran. And he's going to do it. Well, what is this? This is a withdrawal even from what the UN was as a kind of vague commitment to work things out in a non-violent, non-warlike way. And you're going there and beating the drums of war and explaining how you're for America first to a body that's there precisely so that you don't come with this attitude. So you have a situation where you can't answer this question because there's no framework of solidarity, of working these things out. There's just a framework of endless, self-focused money-making. You know, it's as if the world of companies competing is replicated on an international scale, which I think is a conceptual misunderstanding of what it's about. But it's a big question, and I won't get done what I have to get done. All right. I'm going to hold off on the modern monetary theory. Some of you have asked me to talk about it. I will, but I can't do what I would need to do this evening and do that at the same time. Modern monetary theory, just so we won't have said I didn't do anything about it, is a very interesting idea that has come from a relatively small number of economists here in the United States who want us to think about money and how it's created and how it's circulated in the economy in a different way from how it has been thought by the economics profession. It used to be, and we used to teach this in American economics departments, and in most departments they still do, that the only way, for example, a bank can increase the money supply is if you put money into the bank, literally cash money that you have, and you deposit it, and then they create an account. So if you give them $100, you now have the right to write checks for $100. But if you understand how banks work, they take your $100, they are required by law to put aside a portion of it, it's called a reserve, about 20 bucks. But the other 80, they're allowed to lend to somebody else. So notice what happens. You had $100 in cash. You went to the bank, you can now write $100 in checks. For you, you have as much money to spend with the checks as you'd had with the cash before. But because the bank is allowed to lend out 80 of the 100 you gave them, and they do that as fast as they can, that will give a person, some person who borrows that money, $80. Your 100 have become 180. Your 100 in cash have become 100 of checks for you, plus 80 to whoever gets lent that money. And so this story is told, this is how banks multiply the money in an economy. And that's true enough. But these people want you to understand that long ago, that stopped being the way banks work. They don't have to, and they do not wait until people come and put cash money in there. You can go right into a bank, you as an individual, you as a business, and say, I'd like $50,000. And if the banker thinks, sounds reasonable, you have a business plan that looks like it makes sense, they simply create an account for you, and they say, you got $50,000 in this account. That's our loan to you. And you can start writing checks. You don't have to have any cash. You don't have to have anything. And how often can the bank do it? As often as they want. When can they do it? Whenever the hell they want. That's how money is actually created, literally, especially now that it's all electronic anyway, by simply creating an account for you. They do still have to hold back part of it as a reserve. They can't send it out, they have to hold back part. But they can literally lend 80% of what they just created out of whole cloth. And so there's an enormous capacity for the system.
Don't they then have to borrow it from the Federal Reserve?
They have to put a portion on, they have to give it to the Federal Reserve as a reserve for them. And they get paid an interest on that they do.
Don't they get a debit of some kind for the whole 50,000 with the Federal Reserve?
No, they can just issue that as their own obligation. They don't have to do it. Yeah.
A little confused about this. Sounds like you're saying that I, as an individual, can go to a bank and say, I feel like opening up a $10,000 account, and they go, okay, here it is, and you can spend this $10,000.
They give you a loan. On their books, it's a loan to you. That's right. That's exactly what happens.
Okay.
You don't have to have cash.
And
And if you don't have a good plan, but you really know them quite well, that'll do it too.
for special people.
No, but I was just saying it's just on the say-so of the banker. It's good to be a banker. And in the last 30 years, it's been particularly good to be a banker. This economy is now more financialized than it has been ever in our history. But you all know that. You go back 30 years, at least a good number of you can do that. And you go back 30 years and you could not go into a grocery store, buy your bag of weekly groceries and pay with a credit card. You had to give them money. Everything now is mediated by credit. You want this water and you go into a bodega because it's hot somewhere in New York City. And I've seen this now. I would like this thing, and 75 cents, and you give them a card. And it's okay, you give them a card. That card is a loan, for those of you who don't know. A credit card is just a loan. When you give someone a credit card, when it goes through the machine, what actually happens is you borrow from whoever the bank is that issued the card to you an amount of money which the bank immediately pays to the merchant to whom you're giving the card. But on the books, it's a loan, which means every trivial transaction is now involving the credit system. The bank, you cannot buy a car without credit. I mean, a handful of people do, but most of us don't. Ditto for houses. Now, for those of you in the room who are young, you know very well, you can't get a college education without racking up debts. And the minute there's a debt, there's a bank. And the bank does not do debts without getting its cut, its fee, its percentage, whatever it is. So the banks are in everything. When you go into the store and you get your bodega because it's your water because it's hot, the bank gets a cut of that little action.
Not if you use a debit card, though.
No, then it gets another kind of cut. Then there are fees if you don't maintain your account, and they do a variety of things. But yes, it's different if you have a debit card than if you have a credit card. But believe me, that's their job. They work night and day. They hire the brightest minds from the business schools. It's understood that's a low bar, but nonetheless, they do that. And the job of these people when they're hired is to figure out a way to get more money out of you, to offer you things when you come into that bank, to give you a new opportunity, to suck you in on the app you can use to do this transaction or other. It never stops. And then overcharging you for if you overdraw your account or if your check bounces, stick you with a fee, make it a little higher than it's supposed to be, hope you don't notice. At the end of the month, there's a mistake on your account. If you think that mistake is a mistake, then you need help, not the bank. That's the slogan of one big company used to do, "We do it all for you." The truth of it was the slogan really was invented as, "We do it all to you." Okay. I want to turn to the major thing now because it is so important. And I want to start by sort of provoking you with something that is happening in many parts of the world, including here in the United States. And you saw it if those of you who paid attention to Trump's speech at the UN, it was nicely on display there. A turning away from globalization, a turning away from international almost anything, a me first, America first, we are good, we are number one, and the world is a nasty, dangerous place stealing from us. It's a really, what shall I call it, a kind of a Christian outlook. That was a joke, that was a joke. It isn't Christian, is it? You're supposed to welcome the stranger, you're supposed to do all those things that you remember from catechism class or wherever you learned it. This is all turning inward. And the key hallmarks everywhere are the danger, the badness of the foreigner. Mr. Trump comes to office saying things about Mexicans that were so extraordinary that you realize this is a kind of a declaration of some sort. This is so crazy. And you know, immigrants, Mexico has to pay for the wall. You're all aware of this stuff. The evil immigrant. The immigrant is doing it, the immigrant is a problem. Then that's followed a few months later by simply beginning to go after virtually every place in the world. I mean, we are now enemies of Canada. That takes a lot. Canada, you know, Canada. Mexico got it, and Canada. Europeans are useless. The Chinese have become super enemy. And it's not just Mr. Trump, it's pretty much across the board. People are questioning a bit, but it is very widespread. And it's not just in the United States. A few weeks ago, there was an election in a country that hasn't shown this kind of politics for a long time, Sweden. They had an election in Sweden where a right-wing anti-immigrant party got 17% of the vote. That's a lot. Germany has an extreme right-wing party, anti-immigrant, that also did real well and is now part of the German parliament. The French have it. The British had it. For those of you that didn't pay attention, British workers got really revved up on this immigrant thing and the European thing because their immigrants come in large part from Eastern Europe, Poland particularly. So they voted to leave Europe. That's an interesting idea. You're in Europe and you vote to leave. How do you do that? You know? Now, England always was a cold, wet, unfertile little island off the main coast, which is depressing. But they were part of Europe. Now they're just going to be a cold, wet, and they're not going to be part of Europe. And the mass of people who made this election happen, and for those of you who didn't pay attention, the conservative government that runs Britain then and now was against leaving Europe, strongly against it. So was the Labour Party. Not so strongly, but they were against leaving too. It's called Remain. The movement in England is called Remain. Stay there. Stay in Europe. But they were defeated by a vote that they can't back away from now, even though it is taking Britain right into the circular bowl real quick. Italy just changed governments literally a few months ago and now has an extreme right-wing government whose major activity is beating up on immigrants and refusing to allow the boats that come across the Mediterranean with refugees from Libya and from North Africa, not allowing them to land on Italian ports where they were able to go before. I mean, this is really extraordinary. And you have right-wing parties in virtually every country. Netherlands has them, Greece has them, and so on. So what's going on is really what I want to say. And before I give you the explanation, perhaps the worst of them is the demonization going on between the United States and China. This is something you have to pay attention to. China is the second most important economy in the world today. It's huge. It is extraordinarily successful. It has gone from one of the poorest countries in the world 25 years ago to the colossus competing with the United States today. And the decision of the United States government has apparently changed from working with them to participate with them in their growth. They have now been turned into the great enemy whose growth has to be stopped, whose ability to function has to be crippled, which is what's going on. This is, I mean, what you read about tariffs and trade war, this is an attempt to stop China from continuing its incredible history. Whatever you think of China, and I'm not here to argue for or against what they do there, but purely as an economist, if how you look at a society is how it grows economically, in terms of the incomes it can provide its people, standard of living it can provide them, then the Chinese are the most impressive achievement of that ever. They have gone further in a shorter amount of time than the number 2 experience with that, which was the Soviet Union. So whatever else you may think, if you're wondering whether the Chinese model has an appeal in the world, the answer is of course it does, by virtue of what I just said. Most of the world would like to get out from being poor and have a standard of living that's rising anywhere near what the Chinese are experiencing. And so that they have been able to figure out how to develop their economic system in a way that should be the envy of the world. It should have been your envy. But if you didn't, but you live in a country which either doesn't tell you anything about China or tells you something negative. The New York Times is unbelievable. I read it every day. The only stories that ever come in there are stories about something going wrong in China. There are plenty of things that go wrong, so they can have a lot of stories. But the idea of writing a story about things that are going right, it doesn't occur to them. It's like the Cold War never ended. It's remarkable. But of course, the Chinese also have nuclear weapons. And they're also a very big country, much bigger than the United States. 4 times the population. 4 times the population. And no way are they going to be shut down. They are a country that was dismembered by the Europeans in the 19th century, was hobbled for the first half of the 20th century as well, fought revolutions and wars to become independent, to really have its own way. You can't put that genie back in the bottle, and you're crazy if you think you're going to do that. And I don't think Americans think about this, and they certainly don't get any kind of education to understand what they're up against. Okay, so how did all this come about? Why are we in this situation? I want you to go back with me basically to the 1970s, which is where all of this kind of begins to take shape. From the Great Depression, the 1930s to the 1970s, the dominant ethos of economics was what we call Keynesianism, was the idea that the capitalist economy led to itself produces breakdowns like the Great Depression of 1929, and that to avoid that, to get the benefits of capitalism, the government needs to step in and judiciously prevent the bad things from happening and give a nice assist or boost to the good things. This is not anti-capitalism at all. It's a notion that the best way to save capitalism from its own failures is to have the government come in and do all kinds of things. That attitude is what created at the end of World War II, for example, the GI Bill. The notion that the government would give every returning soldier all the money needed to go to college and get a degree, giving Americans who had never dreamed of such an opportunity the means to do it. For those of you not aware, the government built a massive program of public housing. If you ask some of your relatives, they grew up in those houses. Here in New York, we actually still have some of them around. Many other parts of the country, they've been destroyed or allowed to go to ruin. That's why we built the interstate highway system. It was another way for the government to get in and give a boost, connect parts of the country that were isolated and rural into the mainstream by having some interstate go through there, and on and on and on. Government involvement, government activity, government raising money, often from the rich, and spreading it out to everybody else. That was not considered a weird or a bad or a dangerous thing to do. Okay? That lasted until around the 1970s. By that time, the business community, which had never liked any of this, hated all of this, was fearful that if the government had the kind of standing among the people, doing all these things that people benefited from, it was only a short step before those people would demand that the government do something that cost the capitalists more than they wanted to pay. They were already spending money on taxes that they hated. By the 1970s, they were strong enough. The memory of the Great Depression was faded enough that they could make their stand to end that period of American history, which they did. The election of Mr. Reagan at the end of the 1970s, of his counterpart in England, Margaret Thatcher, was the shift. And it meant from now on, none of this government. The government, instead of being what saved us from catastrophe, the mentality of the 30s to the 70s, became not the solution, but the problem. The government which had saved us became the nanny state, the state that takes away your initiative, your desire to succeed. It's your burden. It's terrible. The government taxes you too much. The government wastes the money. The government is bad. And that period of time, 70s to the present, gets a number of names. I'm going to use them all because it's all the same thing. One is globalization. Another one is neoliberalism. Another one is a debt explosion. And another one is a period of unmitigated prosperity. And they're all, in their way, true. Let's go through it real quick. First, the globalization. Capitalist companies in Western Europe, North America, and Japan, starting in the 70s. I mean, some of them had started earlier, but in a massive way in the 1970s, made a basic decision. They had had long and bitter struggles with their workers that produced in those parts of the world, the old centers of capitalism, high wages. They had had to buy off the animosity, the anger of their own workers by raising wages over and over again. So that by 1970, the wages in Western Europe, North America, and Japan were here, and the wages in the rest of the world were down here. And the big businesses were sick and tired of it, just like they were sick and tired of Keynesian policy in the government. So they basically took advantage of the technology of the 1970s, the jet engine and the beginnings of the internet, and said, we don't need to produce where the wages are high. We can produce where the wages are low. And they left in huge numbers. They moved production from the old centers to where labor was cheap. But this was interesting because they couldn't just go where the labor was cheap, because a cheap worker isn't an advantage if he or she doesn't know how to work in a disciplined way, doesn't understand coming to work every day at 9 o'clock, working by the clock, all of the disciplines of industrial life. So the country that was the best equipped in the 1970s to offer a trained, developed, disciplined workforce was the People's Republic of China. Very poor, but very good workers. It was their communist revolution that transformed them into that. And so the movement went to China before it went to almost anywhere else, and more to China than to any place else, despite the language difficulties. Otherwise, they would have all gone to India, where a good bunch of them did end up because of the language, the English. But the Chinese were so much better workers, basically, that they went to China. And this produced an enormous increase in profits for a simple reason. You replaced expensive workers with cheap workers. The difference was so stunning that it more than overshadowed the cost of having to produce things 10,000 miles away and bring them all the way back. Instead of your underpants being produced a few miles from you, they are now produced an ocean away. And it costs a lot of money to bring crates of underpants from China. But the difference in wages to produce the underpants were so stunning that you were still ahead. Profits were made like nobody's business. And the beauty was, and here you get when capitalism works, it's a charming machine to watch. By taking the jobs away from the Americans and the Western Europeans and the Japanese, you could use that as a cudgel to destroy their unions, who had no dues-paying members anymore, and the will to struggle, because there were no jobs for them. And they competed for whatever few jobs were left, so the wages went nowhere. So this enormous boost, this is crucial for you to understand, the enormous boost in profits was not shared with the mass of the working people because they didn't have to. And that enormous increase in profits, gained by substituting cheap workers in the third world for expensive workers in the old centers of capitalism, went to the top. That's why the stock market, which is how you get a piece of those profits, you buy a share, went crazy starting in the 1980s. From the 80s to 2000, the greatest run in stock market history. Run up. Just a second. So you had an enormous growth, here we go now, in inequality. An enormous increase at the top, utterly unmatched by the middle or the bottom. In fact, the middle of the bottom started to go down because of the collapse of unions, because of the disappearance of all those jobs. For jobs that couldn't be moved, there was the alternative: immigration. Bring the cheap worker here. If you can't go to where the cheap worker is, bring the cheap workers here. And all these countries began to experience, if they hadn't already, and some already had done it, waves, new waves of immigrants. Now wrap together in your mind how the working classes of these parts of the world experience this. End of Keynes, end of a government that helps you, together with globalization, together with enormous stock market boom you don't participate in, along with great inequality you likewise don't participate in, but you see around you every day. And you start to get angry, upset, bitter. You're being left out of some enormous historical switch. And given the way capitalist ideology works, the blame falls on you. You're made to believe this is you didn't go to the right school, you didn't take the right subject, you didn't prepare yourself in the right way, you're not living in the right part of town, you're not applying yourself, there's something wrong with you. Everybody's doing well, you're not. And who presides over all of this? Very important for you to understand. The major political parties. It really doesn't matter which one. So Republicans and Democrats take turns presiding over all of this. Bushes, Clintons, what difference does it make? They're all doing this. Conservatives, Labor, Tony Blair, come on. You know, just watch him now. It's hard to imagine that he ever had the position he did. Very important to understand the Social Democrats, the people who had been the Socialist Party, or in this country, because we don't allow that, the Democratic Party. They presided over this too. They didn't know what to say or what to do, so they became neoliberals too. The Keynesian story had been defeated, and they felt to hold on to what they had advocated, Keynesian government, welfare state, all of that, was a ticket to political oblivion. So they had to become neoliberals too, go globalization, stock market going, but we'll help you. We'll be less harsh than those Republicans. So don't worry, we will not do anything to undo the great success everybody says we're having, but we'll be softer to you. We'll care for you a little bit. What the mass of the working class saw instead was what? The erosion of what they had gotten. Their supports from the government were eaten away. Their union supports were eaten away. Their job conditions were eaten away. pensions disappeared, or they went from defined benefit to defined contribution, if you know about how pensions are set up. Everything was done to convenience the employer and to hobble the employee. And the trade unions and the social democratic parties and the Democratic Party in this country was observed by the people who loved those parties as not only unable to get better deals for the working class, they couldn't even protect what had been won in that period from the 30s to the 70s. And so the attitude of the mass base of these parties changed. Why should we vote for the Democrats? What the hell difference is it? You know who signed the bill that got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act that protected us from banks? Clinton signed that. When Obama was elected, one of the things the labor unions had gotten him to agree to was to enable the checkoff, to get the dues paid automatically. He never did it. Never did it. And on and on and on. So what have we got? We've got a mass, this is the key, we've got a mass of people ever bitterer about falling behind. The American dream is out of reach. Other people are doing real well, but we're not. All of that. And they get angry, and there's no prospect of anything getting better. There's no point in joining the union or in joining the Democratic Party. They're not doing anything either. And the difference between them and the Republicans is small, and seems to be mainly focused on people who make noise, make trouble. Women, blacks, maybe that. But not your average white worker. Wow. And that bitterness has to go someplace. It just doesn't sit there. And nothing stops. The inequality keeps getting worse and worse, as it has, uninterruptedly. And the failure of the Democratic Party, the liberals, the social democrats, the trade unions gets worse and worse. So we get to the present period, and what do we have? A decision by the mass of people, okay, if it's intolerable what we got, and if there's no program, no possibility, no prospect, then we'll go to whoever it is who says, I'm going to actually change the situation. And that's where the right wing arrives. Oh, us, we'll do that. Vote for us. We'll get rid of the immigrants so that you won't have them to compete with. You won't have them to pay taxes to support. Whether they're actually competing with them, whether they are supporting them with their who cares? It is somebody who's going to do something for you when there's no one doing anything for you. And you hate the conventional parties because they're the ones who were sitting there while all this was going down, and they never did anything for you. So the appeals of the Clintons and the Bushes or the Theresa May or these kinds of people, what? It's almost to the point, not quite, but it's almost to the point that whatever they're for, the mass of people are against it. In Brexit, that's exactly what happened. The establishment was Remain, and the people all raised the middle finger of their hand and voted to leave. This is a supreme act of irrationality, since out of Europe is not going to make the condition of the English working class one iota better than in Europe. The same people run the society, the same institutions govern this society. The idea that this is all going to be better for you, which is why, by the way, the British have been wobbling about it ever since. And there's a movement now to have another election because the presumption is they're so disgusted with what's happened over the last couple of years, they probably would vote to remain simply because it's another way of venting. And I'm convinced that that's why Americans voted for Mr. Trump. He did one thing and he did it well. I'm not like everybody else. I talk different, I look different, I have strange hair, you know. Everything about me is off. It's disgusting how different I am, and I enjoy underscoring that.
But he lost
The pe-
after the US election.
Yeah, but he did pull it off. He was surprised too that he won. Remember early in the campaign, at one point he said, I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and they'd still vote for me. He too was discovering that he was, how many of you ever saw a film many, many years ago with Peter Sellers called Being There? That's it. Mr. Trump, he was there. He was the right weird fellow at the right moment. A perennial loser who had enough money so he could do this forever. And so he did it the one time, and like a broken clock, twice a day, it's exactly on the money, right? And his broken clock brought him in. And that's why, I mean, he enjoys contravening all of that. He's against neoliberalism, he's against globalization, he's against immigration, everything. That's it. That's who he is. I'm different. You can stay with me because I'm against all of that crap. And I'm serious, and I'm gonna make America great again. I'm gonna somehow reconstitute for all of you what was taken away from you in the last 30 or 40 years. That's why anti-immigration works as a policy, because it's stark. It can be presented as helping the native people you're trying to appeal to, even if the help is marginal or non-existent. What difference does it make? It's something, and you're used to nothing at all. The few times you get something from one of the old established parties, you do hold on to it. But you're bitter. Americans have held on to Obamacare. You know, they haven't let it be destroyed, even though they tried so hard to do that. That's how desperate they are for something. But the anti-immigration gives them something. And the anti-China gives them something, some foreigner to beat up on. It's a very old system. Your society is falling apart. Your divisions are tearing you apart. There is no prospect for hope. Blame somebody. Somebody's really doing it to us. And the sneaky them. The story being told is unbelievably preposterous, but that's not a reason to dismiss it. The important question is, how does that work? How does this junk become accepted wisdom? That's the interesting question. I'm going to give you an example. One of the, and perhaps the most repeated story to justify the horrors of being done against China and trade with China and tariffs with China is something called intellectual property theft. Let me explain to you what that terrible sounding thing is. First of all, intellectual property. What's that? That is an idea of how to produce something, an idea of a product, an idea of something that maybe, if you work out all the details, you could make into a profitable business. And the argument is the Chinese theft have stolen it. Now, first, let's look at this. Let's not be polite either. Let's call it what it deserves. The first part of it is straight out racism. I've been in enough rooms with these people who, if you said you're a racist, would have major heart failure right in your face. They don't think they have this problem. But in fact, as they talk, it becomes clear. Their assumption is that the Chinese people would never in a million years have figured out how to do this. So obviously, since they're doing this, they must have stolen the idea from somebody else, because they're not capable. Really, I mean, right out there. Nice people with suits say that in lovely leather chairs sitting around an academic seminar table. But I won't focus on that. That's just ugly. Here's the idea. Over the last 30 years, the Chinese have copied what is being done in the rest of the world. They have cut deals with corporations, American corporations, Japanese, British, German, and so on, and they've said things like this. You, German company, you would like to take advantage of the cheap workers we have for you here in Shanghai or Beijing or wherever. Okay, and you'd like to sell to the Chinese market that's developing here. Okay, we'll give you access to the workers in our country, and we'll give you access to the market in our country. But you got to give us, share with us your technology. That's a deal. Why would we give you access to our workers, access to our market, and not ask for something in return? It would be strange. But nobody, bear with me here, nobody held a gun to anybody's head. If the American company or the Japanese or the German company didn't want the cheap labor and didn't want the access, it would have said, no, we don't want this deal. End of story. But they didn't do that. They shared the technology. Third point. Every country that has ever gone from poor to rich did so by getting hold of the technology of countries that were more developed than they were. The United States did that all through the 18th and 19th century. What are you talking about? We didn't know how to do anything. We stole it from the British or the Dutch. You live in a city that was planned out by people from Holland who had ways of doing that the American colonists didn't know about. We stole their intellectual property. And maybe someday there'll be a Dutch minister who will come over here demanding money to compensate for the thievery. That's the way all economic development goes. There are courses in economic, I've taught them, called the dissemination or diffusion of technology. It's part of the subject. That's how development happens. You have to diffuse the technology, or else. What are you going to tell? I worked for a long time on Kenya in East Africa. Kenya had a problem. It didn't have paved roads. So it had to pave roads because then the trucks can go quicker and you can do it. Well, I mean, they could have tried to invent paving, but that would have been stupid because there's 20 places in the world that will sell them paving at a fraction of the cost. So of course they went and they got paving because it was the most efficient way for them to acquire it. Everybody does this. And the only way you can make this an issue is either if your people are really ignorant, I won't go there, or you're just counting on people not to think it through, so there's some plausibility to the notion of intellectual property theft, but it's silly stuff. It doesn't deserve 5 minutes of anyone's. By the way, is there some stealing that goes? Of course there is. Are there people who sneak over into the public library and get a journal and figure something out from an archive? Sure they are. And do they not pay for the journal? They photocopy it and they don't put a nickel in the machine? Probably. That's how scurrilous these people can be. It's real junk. This is real junk. Or the claim the government there helps in China. The government helps industries so they get a leg up in competing. Every government in the world does that. You think the United States doesn't do that? When we build a road somewhere, anywhere, the pressure that went on the state to build a road this way in that part of the state to go this way and around the corner, that were industries that had an advantage if the road was routed here, not over there, because it gave them a leg up. It meant that the cost of shipping some input they had was reduced compared to what it would have been if that road had been built some other place. Did the government help them? Of course it did. Of course it did. On the street where I live in New York, not very far from here, shortly after I moved in, I noticed something. Across the street is a school maintained by a religious denomination. I won't mention which one. So I don't want to get on anyone's wrong side. And I went out at night with my little bag of garbage in that wonderful way that New York City has. You fill up a bag of garbage and you heave it on the street, which other people, that's technology going the wrong way, just by the way. Anyway, so there I am putting my bag of crap out on the street, and there are two huge city garbage trucks, each with two men working them, a driver and the guy in the back who loads it up. And they're picking up the garbage of this religious institution across the street. Now that's illegal, 10 ways to Sunday. Somebody's got a deal going. So it was at night where the garbage truck normally isn't busy. They work in the daytime. But somebody had cut a deal. Somebody from this religious community had spoken to some local politician, and so now they saved on that unfortunate bill they might have had to pay to a carting company to come and take the garbage because the city took their commercial garbage from a religious institution. Are they being helped by the government? Of course they are. Are they getting an advantage over others? Yes, they won't have to spend money on garbage collection that their competing church on the other side of the street probably has to pay. Every government does it. Every government has always done it. It would be bizarre if the Chinese didn't do it. When I was finishing up as a graduate student, I had friends who were chemists, and I would go and pick them up at the labs where they were doing their work. And they would introduce me to the others working next to them, but these weren't students and professors, they were commercial chemists working for chemical companies. But they wanted to be close to where the research was being done because they could pick up useful things. And so the university cut a little deal. And basically they rented space in the university's labs to conduct experiments next to the university researchers that were doing their academic research because it made money for them. They learned important things. But of course the university didn't have to pay taxes on its property because they are exempt, like, I don't know, Harvard. And so they could offer rent to these people at a much lower rate than they would have had to spend for any equivalent space anywhere else because they're subsidized by the city, which doesn't collect from the university and doesn't bother to look real closely to whom the university, in effect, sublets. If you wanted to measure all the ways governments help business, you could spend a lifetime and you wouldn't begin to figure it all out. But the United States knows that they're doing that in China, you know. This is horse shit. This is silly stuff. It's pure propaganda. For what purpose? There is no other way to say this. I mean, I'm open to suggestions, but I can't figure it out. That the United States has made a determination that I'm sure this is not Mr. Trump's doing, that China now represents some sort of threat. Not like the Soviet Union, a military threat, if you believe that, but more an economic threat. I mean, they do have nuclear weapons, but it's really more the economic threat that seems to be the issue. And so we're going to make their continued economic growth difficult. You know, China built itself up over the last 40 years as an export center. It became the producer of things for the rest of the world. Very good at it. That's why made in China is something you see on your appliances and your clothing and all the rest. So closing off export market, like the United States, which is what a tariff does, is a particular blow at them. It hurts them. It means they can't sell what they used to be able to sell, which means they can't hire people. And they have moved 300 million people off the countryside into the cities of China, and where are those people going to go? You're producing in China a major economic crisis. And these are not people who are going to let you do that. And where this goes, nobody knows. The people around Mr. Trump, particularly Mr. Lighthizer, the trade representative, Peter Navarro, I don't know how many of you pay attention to his economic advisors, they've been banging the drum about China, China, China for years. They have his ear, and they're making his policy. For him, none of this matters. This is all political theater for his base. He's beating up on another foreigner, the Chinese, just the way he did with the Mexicans. It makes, this is the same story going over and over again. But here's the scary conclusion. I don't know how long this is going to last. Nobody does. I don't know what will be sufficient for Mr. Trump to have his theater so then he can get on with it, cut a deal, explain to the American people what fantastic results he got. Just like yesterday, he explained to the sitting world that he was the best president the United States had ever had. And there, if you look at his face, do it, because the clips are being replayed over and over again, you'll see, obviously, he was proudly telling you what he had achieved. So he lives in another place that the rest of us don't have access to. And now he's decided that what is good for him is this beating up on any foreigners he can think of, on globalization, on neoliberalism, poking at the very people and who ran all of this. I don't know how many of you saw it, but these little moments are very important. About a week and a half ago, the head of the largest bank in the United States, which is the J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, a man named Jamie Dimon, whose name you may see from time to time, made a stupid comment. This is his own self-reflection. A stupid comment in which he said if he ran for president, he would beat Donald Trump. Mr. Trump heard about it, of course, probably within 6-7 seconds of having heard it, and immediately whacked him. I don't remember what Trump said, but whacked him. And immediately Dimon backed off, apologized and backed off. Okay, it's interesting that Mr. Trump, who wouldn't have been invited for lunch at the J.P. Morgan Bank, is now in a position to smack the president of it and get a quick apology from the president of this large bank. Is it because Mr. Dimon likes Mr. Trump? No. Is it because Mr. Dimon is afraid of Mr. Trump? A bit. But even if it isn't the fear, it's he's gotten from Mr. Trump what he wanted. He wanted deregulation. He's getting loads of it. And he wanted a big fat tax cut last December, and he got that too. Bank profits have soared as a result of that tax cut. The whole economy is in a kind of a bubble of activity. Numbers are pretty good. This is because it's, by the way, some of you should enjoy the irony. It's Mr. Trump's, I'm different from everybody else. So being a conservative Republican, he did a Keynesian policy last December. He cut taxes, that's what Keynesians are supposed to do, and boosted government spending at the same time. You know, and if you cut government revenue by giving tax breaks to corporations, but you spend more money, you make a very big deficit. That's the difference between what the government spends and what it takes in tax. That used to be a big no-no for conservatives. He made fun of that. He could care less. And so did all the people with him. All his base. He delivers them difference, naughtiness, America first, no globalization. He's Mr. Naughty, I'm going against the grain. But it would be a terrible, terrible mistake to think this is dismissible because it's childish or the arguments are poor. Let me close by giving you a parallel. When the Great Crash hit in Germany in 1929, like it hit everywhere, millions of German workers lost their jobs like American workers did. 4 years later, in 1933, the German working class was this close to taking power. There had been 3 or 4 elections in a very short number of years, 30, 31, 32. There were 2 left-wing parties, the Social Democratic Party, that party is still in Germany now, and the Communist Party. And together they had over 50% of the vote, several elections. And they were demanding to take over the government. And the right wing came to the business community in Germany and said, you better give us power because you don't have enough support. You're just the capitalists. We're the fascists. We're the brown shirts. My name is Adolf Hitler and I've got a lot of supporters. I'm the only way you can stop the left. You've got to cut a deal with me. January 30th, 1933, they cut the deal with him. Hitler protected the capitalists of Germany from the left. Trump doesn't have a left he has to worry about. We don't have a communist party that has any power, or a socialist party that has any power either. So what is it he offers them? He offers them a solution for at least a short amount of time to manage the mess that neoliberal globalization produced. It's not that it was a failure, it was a success, as I've shown you, in producing extraordinary profits, extraordinary growth. But that success had in it the failure too. The widening gap between rich and poor, number one, and the depression of the mass of people faced with the unending grind of a further inequality. Faced with that, they are beginning to turn. And they don't know where to go. In our election, you could see it. They went for difference. Either Trump on the right or Bernie on the left. Something that was clearly different. When Bernie said, I'm a socialist, boy, everybody knew. In this country, that's different. Okay? So he saved, just like Hitler saved the capitalists from the left wing that their depression had brought into power, so Mr. Trump saves the capitalist here from the, here's the name they use, populism that threatens them everywhere. Look at the British, they're a walking example. Big corporations are leaving London, they're resettling on the continent. They're not going to be stuck in this place that's a little wet, cold, offshore island. Britain faces an unbelievable bleak future. But it brought itself to this. Its populism that it created. By the way, the British have a much worse history of a working class over the last 20 years than we do. Their real wages have gone sharply down. Ours were stagnant. Theirs went down. So they've now waltzed themselves into a total dead end. The problem for Mr. Trump is to try to avoid that. And he offers himself to the Jamie Dimons of the world. Don't mess with me. Because as the Louis XIV once said in France, après moi, le déluge. After me comes the real danger. You can see it with that stiff fellow who stands next to Mr. Trump. Imagine if he were the president. I'm referring to Mr. Pence on Fire, that guy. Think about it. Think about it. The most danger of all, and you hear this now more and more, Suppose the people see through Mr. Trump. They will eventually. Like that story I gave you about the Associated Press saying there are no cuts in drug prices. What happens then? When Mr. Trump dances himself into a corner and people don't believe, if he loses this thing with Kavanaugh, if he gets whacked in the elections in November, what will he be tempted? How does he hold on then? Come on, you all know where this goes.
Martial law.
Then we have a war. And we all have to rally behind our leader in a war to solve a problem. It's really important to pay close attention because this is an economic system that is in very, very deep trouble, does not know how to get out of it, sits here waiting in the hope that something will rescue. Last 2 points. One, unspoken today, but underlying all of this, the biggest single crisis is something we haven't mentioned. It's pensions. The American working class has no pensions anymore. And as people get older, they are going to become desperate. They're going to rely on their children for the help they can't get anywhere else. This is a disaster. It comes slowly, but that doesn't mean it's in any way less dangerous for all of it. And the other one is debt. The whole last 40 years is a fuel of debt. Everything is based on debt and on financialization. And the network of who owes who is such that when everything fails anywhere, it takes everything down with it because we're all connected to each other through the endless debts that we have. The New York Times had a scary story a couple days ago. They looked at where the interest rates are going now that the Federal Reserve is raising them. And they looked at the total debt of the United States. And they announced that within a very few years, 3 or 4, if interest rates go up, the federal government will be paying out in interest more than it pays to the entire military budget of the United States, which is its biggest outlay. What will be left after you pay the interest in the military? Nothing. And how do you deal with that? I wish I could stay, but I'm not really feeling well. I do have one announcement. Michael, come make your announcement. This is a, thank you very much for coming, by the way, folks. Thank you. A reminder, please, to go to our Patreon page if you can, Patreon/Global Capitalism Live Economic Update, and be a supporter. We would be much obliged. We will be here this second Wednesday of November, whatever day that is. And this is an effort to begin a new university here in New York, an open and different kind, and I think it's really worth your giving Michael just a couple of minutes to tell you about it. And I believe he has something to hand out?
Yes, I have handouts, and they're actually handouts outside at the table as
Okay.
well. Of course, is being offered. Rick, myself, Stanley Aronowitz, a large group of people who've been involved in teaching in the New York university system have decided, or we've been talking about this for a long time, to try to form an open left academy or university in which we would begin to build a core curriculum, and it would be alternative learning to what is dominant in the traditional universities, which, in my opinion, after 30-something years of teaching, very defunct and kind of ridiculously connected to the social reproduction of the way things are today, with everybody oriented towards careerism, going to school just to get a job, etc. So this is a new project that we're forming. We're offering classes that started at the old Breck Forum with classes. I'm a philosopher. I've taught at LIU Brooklyn for about 29 years in the philosophy department there. And I've done courses on the history of materialism, post-structuralism, many themes. I'm going to be doing Marxism and philosophy, Marx's relationship to philosophy, and Marxism's, bad relationship sometimes to philosophy. Rick's going to be doing a course on neoclassical economics, traditional economics, and intensive on Sundays, and also Marxist economics, 2 Sunday sessions of 4 hours each. The classes begin on the 29th, this Saturday, at the newly formed People's Forum on West 37th Street. The address is 320 West 37th Street. If you need information, again, the flyers are here. Stanley Aronowitz is going to do the paradoxical idea of progress from the Frankfurt School to Ernst Bloch. You know, what does progress really mean today? What is the dialectical interplay of the notion of progress, both in history and the way Theodore Adorno and Max Horkheimer frame this, and another colleague of ours from BMCC, Peter Bratsis, will do Marxism and its relationship to democracy, the critique of democracy, beginning all the way back with Aristotle, going forward to Nikos Poulantzas. And also, we're in a collaboration with Democracy at Work, we're also working with the Marxist Educational Project, which has been offering courses. That's the old New York Marxist School. They've continued to give courses at the Commons in Brooklyn, and they're going to continue, and Juliet Uselli will teach a course on Marxism, Marxist capital for women only. So whatever that, you know, I guess that's because some people go to these Marx groups on Capital, and it's only the guys that speak and dominate the conversation. So she's framed the course around women reading Capital together in a group. So that's going to be on Tuesday nights. So we welcome everybody. This is the beginning of, I think, something that's very both creative, innovative, and exciting for all of us. We need a space, we need a center, you know, in order to really do good educational work outside of the traditional education institutions. And this is the first time we've sort of come together on this project. So this is the beginning. We hope to offer as many as 15, 20 courses, and also do a summer institute this coming summer 2019, and ultimately develop a very strong core curriculum. And if you need more information, there's a website, radicalimagination.institute. It's on the flyer, as well as
Why don't you just take one and pass
you know,
it?
you can contact the People's Forum. They have the listing of the courses. So I welcome everybody. The courses are cheap. They're like $15 a session, and they turn out to be, if you pay up front for all 10 sessions or 8 sessions, about $12.50 a session. And this goes to paying of rent and very minimally to the people that teach it. And it's been a very exciting project, especially for me. We've had, you know, 20, 25 people, core people, that have come to philosophy on Saturday afternoons for 4 hours, and we've had, you know, about 75, 100 people that have come to these classes over the past 3 years. So thank you very much. I hope to see some of you.